Gerard, without further ado, you're most welcome to the meeting tonight, and we look forward to your talk.
Very good. Thank you very much indeed. So is it picking up okay, Tom? That's fine, thank you. And while it's been recorded, all of this will be posted on the GSI site. It's also been live streamed on the Genetic Genealogy Ireland site, and I'll save it up there as well. So what I'm going to talk about today, the initial title was The Evolution of Genetic Genealogy in Ireland. It's a very broad subject, but what I'm going to do is interpret it through my own particular experience and my own research into genealogy, which will help to illustrate the different breakthroughs which the evolution and the development of the technology has permitted. I will go rather fast because there are a lot of slides, but don't worry because it'll all be posted online. And I have a lot of research topics which I also post online, and I'll be able to give you an address to that. So what I'm going to go through is give an overview of ISOGG, International Society Genetic Genealogy, also Genetic Genealogy Ireland, the things we do. Different people in the organisation have different research interests. My particular ones are Irish surnames, Irish migrations, Indo-European migrations, the Irish reference genome, a new project in Trinity which is called Beyond 2022, which is looking at restoring the archive, or some of the archives of the fire of 1922. Irish Folklore Commission in UCD, York Gospels, CityGen project, and also what's happening in the broader genomics community, not necessarily in genealogy, but genomics applied to human health. And then I'll give a few case studies which are relevant to my own. It's always interesting, I think, to see how it applies in practical considerations. Some of the things I'll talk about are academic studies. You don't have to necessarily understand all of the graphs, but there will be a lot of background information where you can read the studies yourself and understand that. So in our surname, some of the things we do is develop maps. This is a map, it's an award-winning map by the Esri, and I think I donated the A-size version of it to the GSI, maybe down in the archive somewhere. And it takes the 1891 census, and it displays the names or the births, not the census, but the births of 1891, which survived, and it draws a map based on the location of those, and it has different typefaces, different sizes for each of them. We do geographic analysis, SNP analysis. The SNP is a genetic marker. It stands for a single nucleotide polymorphism. We call it SNP for short, and it's essentially a genetic marker. Phylogenetic mapping. This is mapping of the tree of genetic markers. Applying this to clans of Ireland, to Irish surnames and maps, to the big tree, which is the phylogenetic tree, matching of surnames and matching of surname origins. And I've created a Pinterest board, which is an online system. So any research paper we read, or we try and extract relevant information in graphical format, we post it up there. And to date we have about 10,000 research topics, and it keeps growing because the corpus of research keeps growing very, very fast. So it's sometimes difficult to keep up with all of the new material which is coming out. We look at ancient DNA, how that means taking DNA from ancient remains like skeletons from different ages, from the Neolithic age, from the Bronze Age, the so-called Bell Beaker folk, Iron Age, the Celtic period, the early Christian Ireland, Viking invasion, Norman invasion, and then the Anglo-Saxon plantation. So we look at the different migrations in and out of Ireland during these periods and later periods, and we see how genetic genealogy can help there. In Ireland we have several regional groups who have conferences. We've held our 8th annual Genetic Genealogy Ireland conference. We have the annual conference in October in the RDS. We have our 2nd annual conference up in Belfast, and this is usually in February. The RDS one is in October, and we've had 2 annual conferences in Galway now, and there are other regional conferences around the country in County Clare and Munster, in Ulster, and we have a very, very active community of genetic genealogy administrators throughout Ireland. And so this is showing the different logos we've had for the last 7 years. It started, I think, in 2013 and has evolved since then. It's usually a 3-day conference. They're organised by Dr. Morris Gleeson. I usually help out with some of the organisation and the day out for the speakers and for the volunteers. We usually get a lot of volunteers coming, many of them from far afield, from the United States, from England, from Sweden, and so on and so forth. So we have a very active community, and over the last 8 years we've all become very good friends, and we try to attend each other's conferences. And on the day out we try to do some interesting, make it a little bit research, a little bit scientific, and a lot of it fun. So it usually involves a visit to somewhere of interest, either Epic Ireland, which I noticed this week was awarded the Best in Travel award. Last year we visited the ferry terminal here. Previous years we visited the museums and so on and so forth. So over the last 10 years there's been exponential growth in the direct-to-consumer market. We have gone, when I started in 2005, with just a handful of people had tested globally. This was in the newly launched Genographic project, and last week, in fact, the Genographic project stopped taking new applications. It had apparently fulfilled its mission, and one of its missions was to test as many indigenous populations as possible, and it succeeded in doing that. And so Genographic was the first, and then I took some tests in FTDNA, and then 23andMe came along with a test, and they reduced the price, and this made the market grow very quickly. And then Ancestry DNA came out with a product, and they had the power of marketing of Ancestry DNA. So the whole, around 2013, there was an inflection point in the direct-to-consumer DNA market, and sales just took off, and we started to go exponential. And it would reach I would estimate it's probably, as of today, it's about 40 million tests, with the bulk of these, 15 million by Ancestry, and we'll have a look at the breakdown. So we have 15 million plus for Ancestry, 10 million 23andMe, 5 million MyHeritage, Family Tree DNA is over 1 million, the Genographic Project, Living DNA, Helix Full Genomes, GEDmatch, and so on and so forth. Some of these, the main ones in the market, they do sequencing, they sell a product. Some of the others do analytics. That means you can take the data which you received from the testing companies, upload it to a third-party site, and receive additional analytics. So it's and the Irish diaspora is one of the highest tested communities. I think the highest tested is probably the Ashkenazi Jewish community, who are very much. It's a very large diaspora, and they're very much into understanding their origins and so on and so forth. The same applies to the Irish diaspora. So we have 40 million people in the US, we have 80 million people around the world. Many of these people don't even know which village they came from. They don't know sometimes where their ancestors are buried. And so it's a lifelong journey for them to find these things out, and genetic genealogy can help them do that. And this is the ecosystem, if you like, of how it's organized. So you have the testing companies, which we call the industry over there, and they sequence and they provide the product and they sell the product on a commercial basis. And you have academia, and academia do more in-depth scientific study to make breakthroughs in particular domains. Generally, they will do reference data study, or a lot of it has focused now on ancient DNA, because it's very difficult to extract ancient DNA. And then you have the genetic genealogy community. We call ourselves citizen scientists, and we have our own journal, which is Journal of Genetic Genealogy. We maintain the standards for genetic genealogy. We maintain the phylogenetic tree. We organize conferences. We do education. We maintain a wiki. We do blogs, Facebook groups, mailing lists, administrations, and matches, and generally just helping each other. And most, pretty much all of the work is voluntary. People have day jobs, and they do this in their spare time on their weekends, and so on and so forth. And this is one of the projects I'm working on at the moment is the Irish Reference Genome. We look from various sources. I'll talk a little bit about the Irish DNA Atlas, which the Genealogical Society of Ireland played an important part in, and the Insular Genome, which came from Trinity College. Ancestry DNA did their own scientific study with a very large cohort on reference populations. Living DNA in the UK, who have a program to develop a reference population for Ireland, and these volunteers in ISOGG also have published some material on their particular interests. So the Irish DNA Atlas, I think this group was very familiar with it, and thanks to the great work of Seamus and Michael Merrigan, and in fact the whole team, they collected samples from people who had four grandparents, great-grandparents in the same general locality, and this allowed us to form a reference genome, and that was published last year, I believe. Was it last year? And I believe it's an ongoing study, and I received an update from Ed, who was the scientist involved, and they have done some work in Iceland, I believe, and in Scotland, and they're doing further work here. They were involved in the Irish Travellers Project, and I myself, I'm part of the reference, you know, myself and various other ISOGG members have submitted their samples to the Irish DNA Atlas. And in parallel to that, there was a main project in the UK, which is called People of the British Isles. It was run out of Oxford, I believe, yes. And they also published, they didn't use the same granularity as the Irish DNA Atlas. They used 4 grandparents instead of 8 great-grandparents. And they had a large sample size, and they published their data, and it shows pretty much what we'd sort of expect. We see Anglo-Saxon England, and we see a more, if you want to call it a Celtic western fringe, and Scotland, and we see a division right at the border between Cornwall and Devon. We see genetic difference there, and we see a difference between North Wales and South Wales, and we can see the sort of influence of the Dalriada kingdoms between northeast Ireland and southwest Scotland. And Trinity College published their own project with a larger cohort. I think they were up to about 1,000 samples, and this built on the Irish DNA Atlas. We had a little bit more refinement. They discovered for example, the Norse component, which was definitely visible, the Norwegian component in Ireland, which presumably is due to the Viking presence here. We didn't see a very definite Norman component, but maybe it's because the way samples are sourced generally outside of towns and outside of populated areas. And then Ancestry DNA did their study. They submitted a paper, a peer-reviewed paper, and they had a cohort of 770,000 genomes. So this was enormous. This is probably one of the largest scientific projects of its kind anywhere, in any domain, to be able to assemble a cohort like that. And they were able to publish this first of all, and then integrate it into their products and offer different features such as Ancestry Communities, which makes it easier to localize your ancestry. This is my example, and it's very much focused over Connacht. Normally you'd find splotches all over the place, which reflects mixed ancestry. In my case, it's very much focused on that area. And if I zoom in again, it will literally focus me around the borders of North Galway, South Mayo, Roscommon, that area, which is exactly where the bulk of my ancestors who had immigrated, and I'm presuming that this is reflected in the cohort, which a lot of them came from the US. So these were ancestors of mine who had emigrated to the US, and their descendants had tested with Ancestry, and it was reflected in this result. But what is important is that it's very, very powerful, that it's able to zoom in to a locality, and they have about 92 reference regions in Ireland alone. So that makes it quite powerful. And Living DNA is in the UK. They're based in centre of England, and they took the reference data from the people of Rachelle's project and integrated it into their program. And of course, with that project, they didn't have the Irish component, so they're building out that Irish component now. And if anyone wants to participate, if you have 4 grandparents in the same locality, if you want to participate, I think I have a flyer somewhere you can write off to them, and you can have a free test, and they will be able to give you the results. And they have identified, I think it's about 12 different reference regions in Ireland, and they correspond pretty much to the medieval kingdoms which were described at that time in Ireland. And the on my own Pinterest boards, I do a lot of analysis based on the data sets we have to try and figure out where do particular markers come from, and are there patterns we can detect. And the way you do this is using statistical analysis, use big data analysis, and you draw maps, and we are able to make rough approximations of which counties have which particular signature. So a combination between the academic activities, the commercial activities, and the hobbyist activities, we have a pretty good idea now of what is the reference genome of Ireland. And I'll talk a little bit about it later. This is on the Y chromosome. There are 3 types of tests in genetic genealogy. There's the Y chromosome test, which tests the male line effectively. There are 23 chromosomes in the genome, and there are 2 sex chromosomes, X and Y. The Y correspond, only males have the Y, so father passes to son, and so on and so forth. So by analysing this chromosome, we can detect the male lineage going back 200,000 years, for example, to our so-called Adam. We call him Adam, but our genetic Adam, if you like. And in the same way, we can do that on the mitochondrial side, on the female side, to the mother's mother, going back to the genetic Eve, if you like. And this we can do back about 200,000 years. And then in the middle, everything else in the middle, there are millions of people in the middle. These are all your cousins. You know, on average, you'll get about 1,000 cousins on a test. This we call autosomal, and this is only really valid for about 7 or 8 generations. So it will bring us back to the 1600s or something like that. So on the Y chromosome, the dominant do we have a zapper by any chance, or no? Do we have a pointer? No. Not worry, I'll just talk it. Anyway, all of these slides are relevant, so don't worry about it. So you see that the L21 has its highest frequency in Ireland, and then in Wales, and then in Scotland, and then in England, France, and so on and so forth. So it's definitely got an IELTS bias, and the most frequent one are DF49, then followed by DF21, which happens to be mine, and then some of the others, L531, L253, and so on and so forth. So these cluster into big groups, and we have a good idea what's found in these clusters. You know, which surnames are found in there, and which old tribes or clans or things like that are clustering in those. And on this slide, we also see what's called the phylogeny, but how these are broken down. So we have R1b, L151, another name for that is L11. I prefer the label L11. Below that is P312, and this corresponds to pretty much Western Europe. Some people say it's Celtic Western Europe, or ancient Celtic Western Europe, and U106 is ancient Germanic Central Europe. And then we get down to the Isles, which is L21, and the F27 corresponds more to Iberia and the Atlantic seaboard, and U152 corresponds more to Alpine area or to ancient Gaul, if you like, if you wanted to make these breakdowns. So these are the broad brushstrokes of how we do phylogeny. And then this is some of the analysis I mentioned earlier, the analytics, where we look at the map of Ireland, we find where did the genetic signatures fall, and we map them by county, and eventually, hopefully, we'll be able to map them by parish. But we've got 6,500 parishes in Ireland, so that's a big job, and you know it'll take a while for us to do that. But at the moment, we have a pretty good idea of where they fit by county. And one of the boards I've created is about Indo-European, so anything related to Indo-European studies, either the language or the archaeology or the genetics or the culture, I posted up there, and I'm going to go back. So I've done a lot of recent research. There's been an awful lot of stuff published, but it's very difficult to go through. It's very scientific material. It's written in scientific language, which is not the easiest to read. There's some guys out there who are scientists in their own right, but who have written it down in a more readable fashion. One of my favorites is by Carlos Diaz, and he's taken a lot of the most recent studies and synthesized it down so that people can understand it better. And this is an attempt to understand where did we come from? You know, before I was in Ireland, where were my ancestors before that? Which pathways did they come through? Which countries, which territories did they go through? What languages did they speak? What cultures did they adhere to, and so on and so forth. So yeah, so one very important study was by Epi Jones, and it was mentioned earlier that we do have some great scientific research in Ireland, and a lot of the key breakthroughs were made by very young scientists. These are young scientists in their 20s. They're in these ones were in Trinity College in Smurfit Lab, which is run by Professor Bradley, Professor Dan Bradley, excuse me. and there's a lot of good young scientists have come out of it. Anyhow, Epi discovered a component, a genetic component, which we call, up to before research, we had three major genetic components in Europe. We had Western hunter-gatherer, which were on the western Atlantic seaboard type. There's the East European farmer, which was down around Anatolia, and then there's the sort of Siberian Eastern hunter-gatherer. And it was believed that these were the three main components that made up ancient DNA. And Epi discovered another one, which came from the Caucasus, from the South Caucasus, from Georgia specifically, and this was named Caucasus hunter-gatherer, CHG. And this proved to be very important because it became a major component in DNA for the steppe nomadic people later. In fact, it contributed about half of their DNA, and it's the explosion of the steppe nomads which created the vast migration movements in Europe. To give a timeline and a sort of a regional comparison about those very early hunter-gatherer communities, we had hunter-gatherers, and then we had the conversion to the Neolithic, or the invention of agriculture. Some people believe now that this was around the region of Göbekli Tepe, where they have quite recently, in the last 15 years, discovered by Dr. Klaus, these monumental architectures of upright pillars, 6,000 years before Stonehenge, but with almost a superior technology to the stoneworking technology used in Stonehenge. And these were obviously not living enclosures, but they were some types of associated with religion of some sort, or temple or stargazing of some sort. So they're still figuring out what was the meaning of this. About 5 years ago, we had a deluge of new papers, and these came out of David Reich's lab in Harvard, and working with some of the European labs, and one was Brandt et al., and this looked at the mitochondrial DNA which came from the west of Europe, from Iberia, and moved east. And then this was identified with the mitochondrial DNA H, which happens also to be mine, and this appeared to be the timing of this was sometime around the Neolithic, and the Wright paper looked at Eurasian migrations. Hack et al. Looked at comparing the steppe and the Anatolian hypothesis. The Anatolian hypothesis says that Indo-European language spread with agriculture. The steppe hypothesis says that Indo-European languages spread with the nomadic peoples of the steppes. Okay, and for over 100 years there's been a big battle in academia about which of these was the favourite one. And I think with the ancient DNA discoveries, more evidence was given to the steppe hypothesis. And then finally, after the Amnea people, these are the steppe people, after they expanded, they came into contact with an Iberian population which was moving from west to east. So the steppe people were moving from east to west, and they met somewhere along the Rhine, the headlands of the Rhine, And these people, we call them the bell beaker people. Why do we call them bell beaker? Because they were buried with a characteristic beaker, and there are various theories about what was the use of this. It was about the size of a drinking vessel, and in many of them they found the remnants of some type of alcohol, so they think it was used in feasting rituals or in I suppose ancient networking of some type. And a very important paper by Oled, and this was on this came out last year, and this showed this was one of the last clues which enabled us to put together the story of the Indo-European migrations. And there's a group in Germany led by Dr. In the Jena lab, and it's led by Dr. Klaus, and he has proposed a hybrid model which takes element of the Anatolian farming model and the steppe migration models, and he creates what we call a hybrid model. And there's a very good book which was published by David Reich, and it synthesizes all of this, and again it's in a very understandable manner. So it takes all of these very detailed papers and very detailed samples which have been published, puts it into a understandable thing, and that was published last year. However, it wasn't without controversy. It was followed by an article in the New York Times, and in a sense, some of the rest of academia were complaining that Harvard had a monopoly in ancient DNA, and in fact they had created almost an ancient DNA factory. They became very, very efficient at processing these samples, and the fact that they had this ancient DNA factory meant that they were contributing to most of the important papers, and it left a little bit of this dispute within the industry. There was someone tongue-in-cheek made a comment that the aristocratic lab scientists arrived with their superior technology in the space, the pre-existing researchers and their primitive truth implements and overcomplicated belief systems. Of course, this is a joke, right? However, it reflects what a lot of people were thinking, that the geneticists had gone too far, too quickly, and were sort of turning old theories on their head and reinventing history. And again, we had a major paper from Trinity College again, and this was by Laura Cassidy, and this looked at ancient DNA in Ireland, and it took samples from Rathlin Island in the northeast of Ireland. There were 3 bell beaker skeletons there, and they took one skeleton from a Neolithic site in County Down, and they compared them, and they could see they were totally different. So what it was telling us that there was a replacement population coming in. We had the farmers who came in 6,000 years ago, and they built our beautiful megalithic monuments like Newgrange and many of these places, Dote and Note. And then abruptly, about between 4,500 and 4,000 years ago, this new population came in with their superior technology, which was bronze, and their ways of metalworking, and the horse, although the horse wasn't so important in Ireland, with archery, with beautiful wrist guards which were used in archery, and they brought with them their bell beaker, their characteristic bell beaker, and every time their single grave type burial rituals. Previously people had been buried together. So all of these things are the signal of a new replacement population coming in. And again, the Neolithic was, these were the people who built Newgrange, and it was very much a communal type work, and the replacement population appeared to be more individualist, which was reflected by the single grave type burials, and maybe a little bit more hierarchical as well. And this is a view of the bell beakers. When they first came in, they must have appeared like magic. They were taking these green stones, copper, right, and turning it into this shiny new metal, which people had never seen before. And they could do stuff with that metal. They could use it as farm implements. They would definitely have used it in war. But yeah, there are the things we see the archer making the characteristic arrowheads of the bell beaker people, and we see the bell beaker vessel itself, and many people believe that this was used in the feasting rituals, building alliances. The best way to build alliances is to sit down with people, have a feast, maybe have a few drinks with them, and these were characteristics of the bell beakers. And this is a timeline, or this would be an indication of how it first arrived. So we can see the Yamna coming out of the space between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. And these were the steppe pastoralists, and they went from east to west. And about 4,900 years ago, they merged with the corded ware people. It's a different type of archaeology, a different type of vessel, corded ware. And then they went further west, and the people from the southwest, these were the bell beaker cultures, they came and they fused together, and again another demographic explosion, and they invaded the Isles. They invaded initially Britain with possibly 90% replacement of population, and there were many questions. Why was it so important? Why was the population replacement so important? Was it people fighting? Was it wars? And one of the theories is that they brought with them the plague, and the existing Neolithic populations didn't have immunity to the plagues, and just like in the New World in America, when the Europeans went, they brought with them diseases which the native people had no immunity for, and this created the replacement of populations. And this slide here shows how that bell beaker, corded ware, the amnea, and the Atlantic zone. The Irish were always slightly different from Britain. We didn't have the exact same experience. We had more of an Atlantic type archaeology going on, and Atlantic trading networks, and Atlantic lingua franca. And this lingua franca, people, some of the researchers say, was the predecessor of the Celtic language, or it was, if you want to call it, a Proto-Celtic or a pre-Proto-Celtic language which developed along the Atlantic Facade. And this is the timeline for that happening. 4,700 years was time of diffusion on the Rhine. The origin of bell beaker about more than 4,700 years ago, and then about 4,500 years ago they arrived in Britain, and between 4,500 and 4,000 they arrived in Ireland. And But the experience in Ireland was slightly different from Britain. In Britain, the massive replacement of the existing population. In Ireland, less so. More blending with the previous Neolithic people. More burials in the megalithic tradition. More harmony, if you can say that, between the two populations. And there's a very good series of books. I've read them all, and they're quite large, about that size. Celtic and these were published over the last 10 years. The latest version came out this year, and it's exploring Celtic origins, and it's by Professor Barry Cunliffe of Oxford and Professor John Cook of the University of Wales, and they argue for this Atlantic zone of influence, of trading networks, of lingua franca, of and they've done a lot of research. They have databases with all of the artifacts which are identified. In fact, you can go onto their website, identify what artifacts you want to look at, and print out your own maps based on that, and do your own research. And I certainly have found it very, very useful. So these are some of the maps they come up with, and one of the things we see is this focal point around Brittany, and there are several papers which have approached this in a different view. There was one on the megalithic cultures, and they're saying that it appears that the megalithic cultures expanded north from Brittany and expanded south from Brittany along the Atlantic and then around the Mediterranean. So they have identified this region, which they call the Atlantic Facade, and this also happens to be where the modern Celtic language are found. So I'll go a little bit quickly, and John Koch specifically identifies the cyst tradition. If you remember, if we go back again to the 3 bell beakers who were found up in Rathlin Island, they were buried in cysts, and the cyst is it's like a coffin, except it's made of stone, very long stone slabs. It's not the big megalithic chambers, and it's not so it's a very specific type of burial, single burial, and you can trace these as they expanded from 2,200 to 2,100 down along the Atlantic Facade, and it seems to track these people. And his argument is that the language spread with these people. But I think it's probably a little bit early to make definitive prognostic on that. There will be a lot more research done. There will be a lot more evidence collected, and I'm sure there will be a lot more debate around this topic. Now, this is the map that I grew up with, which was this was the Celts of Julius Caesar, the Bello Gallico, and the Romans told us about the Hallstatt Celts and the Latin Celts, and it was an Iron Age movement, and it expanded from there, and they invaded the Isles and they settled in Ireland, and all of this happened in the Iron Age. I think that probably did happen with Celts, but the people who had the same genetic makeup of these people had already been in Ireland 4,000 years ago, and had already been in Iberia 4,000 years ago. So in a sense, it's resetting the clock, and it's forcing us to rethink, what was the origin of the Celts. And this is a map I produced, I think was about 10 years ago, or maybe a little more recent, and people said, it can't be right because this is modern DNA map. This is where these genetic markers are found today. And he said, well, the past was a totally different land, and this must be wrong because we had different. But I think a lot of the very recent papers have told us that already 4,000 years ago, we had established the genetic makeup of the people of the Isles. Of course, it changed slightly since then, but the broad brush strokes of it had been settled about 4,000 years ago. And we see similarities between the warrior stelae found in southwest Iberia and the warrior stelae found in the Mycop cultures, which are just in the North Caucasus, just south of the steppes. And so this has led to an idea about if you follow the stelae, you can probably map the migration routes. And then we've moved in from the Iron Age Celts, and then we come into Christian time. This is a period very interesting to me because when I researched my own family name, which is Corcoran, and all of the references in the annals, find them in monastic locations, and the tradition has been that it was an Erenach family. That means they were present on church lands, and the church owned about 30% of the land at these times. So the land needed to be farmed, and you needed lay people on the land, and that was the function of the Erenachs. But they also provided teachers, and they provided ecclesiastics, and they provided maybe bards and philiads and those types of profession, probably not warriors, but so they were constantly found clustered around monastic lands. And so when I dived deeply into it, I did an analysis of the names found in the census, and I mapped them against the monasteries in Ireland, and there was almost a 1-to-1 mapping. And the specific monastic centres I was interested in was Devonish Island in Fermanagh, where the early Corcorans are found. And then after the Norman arrival, they were displaced south. And we found them in the 6th century already the founder of Lura in Tipperary was St. Ruan, and St. Kieran in Clonmacnoise, and St. Brendan in Clonfert. And this will become important a little bit later on, that as I continued my research, I was constantly being pulled back into these types of monastic settlements. And in a few of my Y DNA matches, most of them matched Gaelic names around traditional Gaelic locations. A few of them, but 2% of them had Scandinavian names. And I've always wondered why was this, and probably a logical explanation was, well, these monastic settlements were the primary targets of the Vikings, and somewhere along the line there was a mix-up in the gene pool, or a mixing of the gene pool, and a descendant of that Ireland was taken over to Scandinavia, or one of the Vikings settled in Ireland, and that would explain the 2% anomaly in my Y DNA. And then the Normans came, 1160, and this was Strongbow, and on one half of my family was Anglo-Norman, which was on my maternal side. My grandmother was a Welsh, which was by origin a Norman name. So I became very interested in the Norman research, and my current focus is to find male living descendants so I can test the Y chromosome and explore fully the Walsh side of my family. And where we are now, when we started all of this research, we built a phylogenetic tree, or a DNA tree, if you like, and we had about 10 little scrawny branches on the tree, and now it's a big bushy tree with the current number is we have about 9,000 branches on the R1b tree, which is the ones which are of interest to me. And one of the most prolific of those is L21, which is the dominant marker we find in Ireland. And we're at the stage now where we can attribute those to specific surnames. We have looked at all of the big Y tests, and these are the deep testing of the Y chromosome, and where we get at least three branches with the identical surname matching, it means it's probably associated with a founder population which had that name. It's not a coincidence or it's not an accident, and we have about over 100 of those cases now, and at least 50 of them are of specifically Irish surnames. Most of the others are Scottish or Welsh. So we are there's a lot of work to do yet, but we are part of the way along the road of mapping these genetic signatures to surnames which exist and which evolved in Ireland over the last 1,000 years. And we have allocated them to specific known individuals. For example, Brian Boru, his direct descendant with a genealogy is Conor O'Brien, and Conor kindly tested for us, and we confirmed his test, and by analysis of hundreds of other testers, we triangulated back to the date of Brian Boru, so we know the genetic signature of Brian Boru. We also know of the Ryle Stewarts, we know of the Eli O'Carrolls, one of the Eli O'Carrolls, who was, they lost their land during the parliamentary wars, and they were granted some estates in Maryland, and they became very large landowners in Maryland. In fact, Maryland was the only Catholic state in the US at the time, and Charles Carroll of Carleton became the only Catholic signer of the Declaration of Independence. And we know his signature, and he is DF21, which is the same signature of the bell beaker, who we found in Rathlin Island 4,000 years ago, and it happens to be very similar to my one, although I'm a slightly different branch. So we can make all of these connections, and as we get more data, and as we get more people testing, we can do more and more analysis around this. And there's very interesting, you cannot see this, but this is about 100 very, very detailed genealogical trees, ancient genealogy trees, family trees, and these are of ancient Irish chieftains' kingdom from about 1,000 to 1,500 years ago. And these genealogies were put together by Barjaski, and it was published in a book on medieval kingdoms. And so again, we're looking at these ancient genealogies and mapping them to our own phylogenetic trees, and this will give us a more powerful tool to be able to do this matching. Another very important tool that I use, and I've only really started to use it recently, and this is the Down survey, and it is absolutely amazing. It's so entertaining. There are some beautiful maps in there, and they cover exactly the period 1650 1670, but the Cromwellian Moors were the 1650s. And in my case, our Corcorans were found in Lura, in County Tipperary, and they were on the lands of the Kennedys, and the Kennedys had Trinity Castle. They also had Redwood Castle with their Brehons, or McKeegans were in Redwood Castle. And both of these large clans, if you like, they were dispossessed and they were moved west, you know, to Connacht. So they settled in Clonfert. So I was able to find out the exact places where my ancestors lived. There's a field called Corcoran's Field. There's a corn mill beside it. And so it helped me solve a lot of the research problems I had been grappling with for a long time. And there's another set of maps, and this is the Ordnance Survey maps of 1890. And if you click on, if you zoom in on the map, and let's say, okay, I'm interested in Clonfert because that's where my ancestors ended up, and I'm interested in Lura, that's where they originated. And somewhere along the 19th century, one of my granduncles was parish priest of Portumna, and he engineered a match between his brother and my grandmother, who was Walsh, back in Lura again, so back on the old land, and so they married back into the old land. You know, and this, I'm sure it's not a unique case in Ireland. I'm sure it happened all the time, and it's a very interesting story. But I wouldn't have been able to solve all of these puzzles without the the Ordnance Survey maps and the Genetic Genealogy. And then only last year I met three elderly brothers three Corcorans in Ireland. They're in Dublin. They were retired school teachers, and their families had all been millers. So I suddenly started getting interested in mills, and I bought there's this index, the definitive work of mills and millers in Ireland, and they have entries for about 1,000 of them. And these mills are amazing. They're all over the country, in fields and little streams and run races and things like that. So apparently one branch of this family which went over in the 17th century, my branch settled in Clonfert around the monastic area. This branch went further up to Dunmore, and they opened about 9 mills, and I was able to trace all 8 of the mills, and most of them are standing. So. And one is restored as a museum, and it's in Tuam, and it's a museum now, and it's a working mill at the same time. So, what are the other projects we did with how much? I'll go a little bit quickly.
You're okay.
Yeah. So, with the Irish DNA Atlas, one of the branch projects of that, I talked to Jab Hero. He asked me to help out on this, and this was the Irish Traveller's DNA, and is looking at to try and solve research. Were they the same as the Irish population? There was some mythology that they were Roma, and they weren't, or that they appeared only in the famine. They lost their land in the famine, and that's what created a travelling population. So there was also an award-winning documentary on it. It was called John Connor's The Travellers. And we tested a fairly large cohort, analysed it, and they identified the different clusters around Ireland and how they travelled and how they intermarried and how far back they went and when they diverged from the settled population. And the conclusion was that the divergence happened as we would expect, somewhere between the Tudor, the Cromwellian and the Williamite period, which was the period of massive disruption in Ireland, even more so than the Great Famine. And so that was a very, very interesting project to do, and made some interesting discoveries. Another project we're working on, the Trinity College Dublin set up a project called Beyond 2022, and its purpose is to, we all know that in 1922, one of the greatest disasters in Irish genealogy happened when the Records Office in the Four Courts went up in fire, and 800 years of records and research went up in fire with it, and we thought that we would forever be bereft of records and genealogies from that period. It appears that copies had been made in PRONI, the Public Records Office, not full copies, some copy, partial copies. Copies had been made in the public records of the United Kingdom, and copies had been made in private collections in the big houses and estates and so on and so forth. So the object of this project is to recreate this Public Records Office virtually, so you can visit it as if you were visiting it in those days, and browse along the shelves and pick out the documents that are there, and maybe they will be able to restore 30% of the content. So it's a very worthwhile project, and it will be launched. It will be finished, I think, 2022. A tragedy struck just a few weeks ago. The principal professor, Professor Seamus Lawless, you may have heard on the news. He was lost on Everest, and so that's a tragedy, obviously, for his family and for his friends. He was a remarkably talented researcher, and I've never seen him where he wasn't smiling or helpful, or trying to make this great project happen. And this is some of the views from the fire at the time. The whole building exploded, and there was paper flying all over the place, and burnt in ashes and falling down on Dubliners for a long while afterwards, and people trying to salvage and collect pieces of paper, and so some of them were salvaged. And some of the archives were up in PRONI, some of the very ancient rolls and manuscripts were kept up in PRONI, Public Records in Northern Ireland. And by the way, if ever you're up in Belfast, it's well worth a visit. It's a magnificent collection up there. And the National Archives in the UK. So that's one of the other things which interests us is ancient genealogies, and there's although we lost so many records in 1922, we do have quite a rich collection of ancient genealogies, because surnames were adopted quite early on in Ireland, probably the earliest in Europe, and we had a lot of monasteries of monks which were very proficient at writing stuff down, and so we do have a lot of sources like the Annals of Ireland, of Inishvallen, of Ulster, of Munster, the different histories, MacLysett. We have the genealogies of the Hymanis, the Kellys. We have the Cleary books, which is one of the oldest genealogies in Ireland. The Great Book of Irish Genealogies. I have a copy of that myself. So there are about 20 superb sources of ancient genealogies, and but they're not digitized. Some of them are digitized. So I think it'd be a worthwhile project to try and at least make sure that there's one secure copy of them somewhere, so that in case we do have a disaster, or if these things are lost, sometimes the safest place to keep them is in the cloud. And that's I got delivery of my new scanner. I think that's what I'll be. That's one of the projects I've set my mind to. So see if we can digitize some of that, maybe index it, maybe catalog it, maybe link it back to these phylogenetic trees which we mentioned earlier. And a few other projects along the way, as I mentioned, we have our annual conference, and then usually the day after we have a day out for the speakers, and we went to UCD one year, and there's an amazing collection there on the Durkas of the Irish folklore collection, and it was children in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and the schools organised them to write down all of their folklore, and it's just amazing. It's stories which you would never find in a normal research avenues, just little local gems which are very relevant to history of villages and communities and districts. One other thing is the York Gospel, and again this breakthrough happened in Ireland in Trinity College, that all these ancient manuscripts were made from animal skins, either calf or sheep skins, and of course there's DNA in these skins, right? And you know, we don't even have to do invasive cutting snips off the pages to test them. When you're cleaning these pages, you usually do it with a very normal eraser, and that creates, you know, remember your school days, all the little dust that comes off, that's full of DNA. And it's just perfect for testing DNA, and you're cleaning the page at the same time. And so then they can do a lot of analysis of that DNA. They can say, well, it's from this breed of sheep or that breed of sheep, or those sheep are related or came from this region or that region, and it's this age, so it helps a lot to understand the context of when these books were written. And now we're getting into a new area where it's not just the geneticists, as I mentioned forward, working in isolation and upsetting the linguists and the archaeologists. So finally, in academia, you're getting blended faculties where these are cooperating together. And this is the case of CityGen, and you have University of York, Trinity College, University of Iceland, University of Copenhagen, and they do research projects covering everything, covering genetics, linguistics, archaeology, culture, language, sociology, whatever. And it tends to lead to a much more balanced type of conclusion rather than just looking at the raw analytical data.
Gerard, would you be happy to take a Q&A from people? Have you?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah. So the other one in Trinity, I'm going to go very, very quickly now.
Yeah. It wasn't a prompt.
For New Irish Studies, this is in Trinity, and interdisciplinary research of Irish people, and it's a wonderful place. And again, they're doing this new type of research. Now we go on to a new area. The genetics is increasing exponentially. If I said to you that 15 years ago, the first human genome, it took 10 years to sequence, and it cost $3.7 billion, right? And I bought one a few months ago for $199, and it probably took a day to sequence. And probably in a couple of years, the healthcare precision medicine companies in the world will be giving her away free of charge, because the data generated is so valuable. This is the book of your life, and this is very, very valuable data. And so we have in Ireland a startup in Trinity a few years ago. I remember meeting them at the beginning, and that was GMI, Genomics Medicine Ireland, and last year they were acquired for $400 million, or 350 million euros, something like that. And this is to do healthcare research, and it's looking at genomes, and the objective is that many of the killer diseases will identify cures by analyzing the genomes and identifying rare diseases and leading to cures. There's also another project which is about wellness, and I participated in this project, and this is for fitness. So They did the entire campus of Belfield. I also joined in because I'm interested in this stuff. So they put you in a sort of an MRI machine, and they measure your bone density. They put you on a bicycle to do cardio, and they do all sorts of stuff. And then they take a blood sample, not a spit sample, to do your DNA, and they analyze all of that together, and it comes up with a measure. And I was quite pleased that even though I'm not exactly a spring chicken, I competed very well against those young students, so I was very happy with that. But so the Genofit, they opened another store in Pearse Street, so they're doing the other campuses. They're doing Trinity College. I'm sure they'll do DIT, or TUD as it's called now. I'm sure they'll do DCU as well. So just some very practical case studies, and I'll go through it very quickly. This way, if you all remember, 2013 was the year of the gathering, so I had to organize my own gathering. So I identified some ancestors who had migrated during the famine to Minnesota. Classical story. They participated in the civil wars. They were granted lands up in deepest Minnesota, and they set down the roots there. And I invited a group of 20 of them came back, so I took them around to all of the different places in Lura and Clonferret and the graveyards there. This is Bill. He's now 97 years old, but this is finding his great grandfather's grave, and that's Michael Corcoran. And all of these there's a full line of them in Clonferret Cathedral, and right over near the wall, his father is lying down, and his name was Hugh Corcoran, and that's from the early 1700s, late 1600s. And somewhere else in the graveyard is his father again, who's another Hugh. So that was the group, and I'm sure this was multiplied many times throughout Ireland. And just last bank holiday weekend, I had another branch of this family who came down, so we repeated the same exercise amount, and this is really good fun.
Gerard, I'm going to be very rude. I think the porter will be coming around in about 50 minutes.
Okay.
So if you just
This
do a quick closure.
This particular one is my maternal line. My grandmother, Walsh, they emigrated to Australia. They ended up in San Francisco, and this particular Walsh, Thomas, he became the leading architect in San Francisco, and many of the notable buildings, churches were built by him. This is, again, on my maternal side. They left Dunmore, none of Foxes. They ended up in California. They ended up setting up the largest area in Santa Monica, and others ended up being mayors of San Fernando. So these are the ones I know about. I don't know about the other ones, but I'm sure there's. And this is the mill in Tuam, which I mentioned earlier, which has been restored. And this is another branch which I found, which is why I'm so into mills at the moment. And I think that's it.
Thank you very much, Gerard.